Most people think they know the worst of this marriage: a husband humiliated, a wife who loved a prince, a tape that shamed a nation. But the truth of the Parker Bowles marriage is stranger and quieter than the scandal that swallowed it. For 21 years, a household cavalry officer and the woman who would one day be queen lived a marriage the country believed in, and a marriage the country would never have forgiven. Both of them were unfaithful. Both of them knew. And for 2 decades, everyone who mattered agreed to look away. Forget the wronged husband of the headlines. This is the story of an arrangement, and of the whole establishment that held it up until the day the country stopped agreeing to pretend. If you are drawn to the private choices the Crown works hardest to bury, subscribe to Silenced Crown and stay close with me, because the marriage in this story reached all the way to the throne, and almost nobody understood what it really was. Chapter 1. The officer everyone wanted to trust. He was the kind of man a whole establishment opened its doors to, tall and Catholic and charming, and that was exactly the danger. Andrew Henry Parker Bowles was born on the 27th of December 1939 in Surrey, into a family that sat exactly where the old English gentry liked to sit, close to power and comfortable there, without ever needing a crown of its own. He was the eldest of 4 children. His father was Derek Henry Parker Bowles of Donnington Castle House in Berkshire, a man who moved easily in racing and court circles. His mother was Anne Parker Bowles, born a de Trafford. Through his father, the family reached back to Thomas Parker, the 6th Earl of Macclesfield. Through his mother, he was a grandson of Sir Humphrey de Trafford, the 4th Baronet, a celebrated owner of racehorses. These were people who bred horses and kept faith and knew the right families, landed and secure, and Roman Catholic in a country that had spent centuries being nervous about Catholics near the throne. That faith is not a detail to be hurried past. It is one of the hinges of the whole story, and it was already shaping his life before he understood what it would cost him. To be a Catholic of good family in mid-century England was to belong to a distinct and self-aware world, proud, old, a little apart, conscious of a history in which its ancestors had been kept from the highest offices of the state. It bred a certain confidence and a certain reserve at once. He was educated at Ampleforth College, the great Benedictine Catholic school in Yorkshire, a place that turned out confident, well-mannered young men for the army and the professions, and that wrapped its boys in ritual, discipline, and the quiet assumption that they were being prepared for a life of consequence. From there, he went to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and in 1960 he was commissioned into the Royal Horse Guards, the regiment known as the Blues, one of the 2 regiments of the Household Cavalry. The Household Cavalry is the sovereign's own mounted bodyguard, the men in breastplates and plumed helmets who ride at the monarch's side on state occasions. To be one of them was to belong to the innermost furniture of the monarchy itself, to stand, in uniform, at the exact point where the country's history and its present met. For a young man of Andrew's background, it was the natural home, and he filled it perfectly. He had the bearing, the seat on a horse, the ease in ceremony. He looked, from the first, like a man the Crown could rely on, and in every way the Crown cared about, it could. He looked the part in the other sense too, and that mattered more than anyone admitted at the time. He was tall and handsome and effortlessly easy in company, the sort of officer who made senior men laugh and made young women lose their heads. He was physically brave in a way that impressed a horse-loving country. He was a bold amateur steeplechase jockey, and in 1969 he rode a horse called the Fosser in the Grand National, the most dangerous and famous jump race in the world, a course that has broken the bones of braver men than most. In the middle of the 1960s, he had served as aide-de-camp to the Governor-General of New Zealand on the far side of the earth before returning to the ceremonial heart of his own regiment. Everywhere he went, doors opened, and he walked through them with a smile that made people glad to have opened them. Look at the shape of a young man's life at that height, and the pattern of a charmed existence is unmistakable. Born into an old Catholic family with a baronet for a grandfather and an earl in the bloodline. Godson, by several accounts, of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother herself, a claim widely reported and worth stating as such. Schooled at Ampleforth, trained at Sandhurst, commissioned at 20 into the sovereign's own bodyguard, riding in the Grand National before he was 30, and posted, as a young officer, to represent the crown on the far side of the world. A young man could be forgiven for believing the world was arranged for his convenience, because in almost every way that mattered, it was. He had been handed the manners, the connections, the uniform, and the charm, and he wore all four lightly. But there was one appetite the doors could not manage, and it was the appetite that would define his marriage before the marriage even began. Andrew Parker Bowles was a ladies' man of formidable reputation, and that reputation ran for years before any wedding, not whispered as a secret, but known as a plain fact by everyone in his circle. He was charming to women, and, by long reputation, a womanizer, and he saw no contradiction in being both. In the world he came from, a certain kind of man was permitted a certain kind of freedom, provided he kept his manners and kept things discreet. Andrew had the manners. He had the discretion of his class. What he did not have, and would never have, was the capacity to give himself wholly to one person and mean it for a lifetime. This is the man the establishment trusted, and the trust was not misplaced in the ways it cared about. He was loyal to the crown. He was brave. He was good company. He would serve the monarchy faithfully for more than 30 years, and the monarchy would reward him for it with rank and honour and a place close to the sovereign. The trust was misplaced only in the one place no institution ever thinks to look, which is the interior of a marriage. The very qualities that made him such a welcome guest at every great house in England, the charm, the ease, the light touch, the refusal to take anything too heavily, were the same qualities that would come to shape the strange marriage he was about to make, in ways the biographers would spend decades trying to describe. There is a particular irony in a society that vets a man so carefully for loyalty to an institution and so carelessly for loyalty to a person. Andrew Parker Bowles passed every test the establishment set him. He would spend his life inside the machinery of monarchy, at ceremonies and at Ascot, at the sovereign's side and in her household. And all the while, the marriage he made would run on a private understanding that the establishment would have been scandalized to name aloud, and yet did almost everything in its power to protect. The world had built him to be trusted. It had not thought to ask what he would do with the trust behind a closed bedroom door. It is tempting to make a simple villain of a man like that, and the film should resist the temptation, because the truth is more interesting than a villain. Andrew Parker Bowles was, by every account that survives, genuinely kind, genuinely brave, and genuinely good company. A man people were glad to see walk into a room and sorry to see leave it. His reputation with women was never a matter of cruelty. It was a kind of ease, a lightness that never quite fastened onto one person, and it lived alongside real warmth rather than in place of it. That is what made him so dangerous to a woman who loved him, and so easy for a whole establishment to trust. A cruel man is easy to guard against. A charming and unreliable one is not, because everyone keeps forgiving him, and Camilla Shand would spend 7 years forgiving him before she ever became his wife. By the end of the 1960s, this charming and faithless officer was among the most eligible bachelors in a small and glittering world, and one young woman in that world had already decided he was the man she wanted. She had decided it years earlier. She had gone on deciding it through every interruption, every straying, every silence, through every season in which he drifted towards someone else, and every season in which he drifted back. Her name was Camilla Shand, and she had been waiting for Andrew Parker Bowles for the better part of her adult life. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Waited 7 Years. Long before a prince, there was a soldier, and Camilla Shand had loved Andrew Parker Bowles since she was barely out of the schoolroom. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on the 17th of July, 1947, at King's College Hospital in London, and raised in exactly the world Andrew belonged to. She was the eldest child of Major Bruce Shand, a decorated cavalry officer turned Mayfair wine merchant, and of Rosalind Cubitt. She grew up at a house called The Lanes in East Sussex, in the horse-centred country house life of hunts and paddocks and long lunches, and she moved through it with an ease that everyone who knew her remembered. She was warm and funny and unpretentious. She was comfortable with men in a way that many young women of her generation were not, able to tell a joke and take one, happier in a stable yard than a drawing room, at home on a horse and in a field, in a way that no finishing school could teach. People liked her. People went on liking her for the rest of her life, even those who disapproved of everything she did. Her father explains a great deal about her, because Bruce Shand was the kind of man who explains a whole family. He was born on the 22nd of January 1917. He served in the 12th Royal Lancers and won the Military Cross during the withdrawal to Dunkirk in 1940, then a bar to it in North Africa in 1942. He was wounded and captured near Marsa Matruh in November 1942, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Germany. Afterwards, he became a Mayfair wine merchant and a master of the Southdown foxhounds, and late in life he wrote a modest, elegant memoir called Previous Engagements. He was brave, understated, and correct, a man of the old code, the sort who did difficult things and declined to make a fuss about them. His daughter grew up inside that code and absorbed its rules in her bones. One of those rules was discretion. Another was endurance. A third was that you did not complain, whatever the provocation. All three would serve her, and cost her, in the years to come. She made her debut as a young woman, went to the parties, met the eligible men, and out of all of them she fixed on Andrew Parker Bowles. They met in the late 1960s. In one well-sourced account, the introduction came through Andrew's younger brother Simon, who worked at her father's wine firm, a small domestic detail that says something about how tightly woven this world was, a world in which brothers introduced sisters' friends and marriages were made across the counter of a family business. From the start, she was the more constant of the two. She loved him with a steadiness that he never returned in kind, and she went on loving him through every interruption, of which there were a great many. Her mother, Rosalind Cubitt, had raised her in that settled Sussex world of hunts and house parties and the long, unhurried rhythm of the countryside, and Camilla took to it as though she had been made for it, which in a sense she had. She rode well. She was easy in a field and easier in a stable. She could hold her own in a room full of confident men and make them laugh rather than merely defer to them. Everything about her fitted the life Andrew Parker Bowles led: the hunting, the horses, the country weekends, the shared friends. And that fitness was part of the trouble, because it meant there was no obvious reason for them not to marry, except the one reason that mattered, which was that Andrew was not ready to be anyone's husband, and would not be for years, She was the perfect match for him in every way, but the only way that counted. Because Andrew did not stand still. Theirs was an on and off romance that ran across several years, passionate when it was on, broken again and again by his wandering eye and by the intervals when he pursued other women, including, at the very highest level, the Queen's own daughter. Camilla would have him back, and he would drift, and she would wait, and the pattern repeated itself until waiting became the defining act of her young womanhood. By the early months of 1973, she had loved Andrew Parker Bowles, on and off, for close to 7 years, and she had watched him court a princess in the middle of it. Picture the arithmetic of that patience, because it is the emotional core of who she was. 7 years of a woman's 20s, the years a young woman of her class was expected to marry and settle, spent orbiting a man who would not commit. She was born in 1947. By the early 1970s, she was in her middle 20s, past the age at which most young women of her circle were expected to marry, watching friends pair off and settle, while the man she wanted kept slipping the hook. In that world and that decade, an unmarried woman in her middle 20s felt the clock more sharply than any man of the same age ever would. There were quiet judgments passed at dinner tables, gentle questions from relatives, the slow accumulation of a reputation as a girl who had not quite managed to marry. Camilla felt all of it, and still she waited. What was she waiting for? And why him? Part of it was simple. He was charming and handsome and fun, and she had loved him first and could not easily stop. But part of it went deeper, into the psychology that would carry her through everything that followed. Camilla Shand was a woman who, once she had given her heart, did not take it back. She was constant by nature, loyal past the point where loyalty served her, and drawn to the man she had chosen even when the choice was plainly against her own interest. It is the trait that would later look like scandal, when the man she could not stop loving turned out to be the heir to the throne. But the constancy came first. And in the beginning, it was aimed entirely at Andrew, the officer who kept leaving and kept being forgiven. There is a quiet irony the story never quite escapes, and it is worth naming now because it shadows everything that comes after. The very steadiness that made Camilla wait 7 years for Andrew was the steadiness that would later bind her, across a marriage and a divorce and 2 more decades, to Charles. She was built to love one person and go on loving them whatever the cost, whatever the world said, whatever it took from her. The tragedy of her young life was that the first person she chose to love that way was a man constitutionally unable to love anyone back in the same measure. The gift she had, constancy, was spent, first and longest, on a man who did not know what to do with it. What that constancy cost her in the eyes of her own world was real, and the film should not soften it. A young woman of her class who reached her middle 20s unmarried was, in the quiet arithmetic of that society, beginning to fail at the one task the world had set her. Her friends were marrying. The debutante season that had introduced her to eligible men was receding into the past, and each year that passed made her a little less the fresh young thing, and a little more the girl who had waited too long for a man who would not have her. She bore all of that with the understated good humor her father had taught her, and she went on waiting anyway, because she had chosen Andrew and she was not built to unchoose him. It is the first great act of the constancy that would define her whole life, spent on a man who did not deserve it and would not, in the end, be the one who kept it. And while she waited, Andrew was not idle. He had found, at almost exactly the moment Camilla was falling for the Prince of Wales, a romance of his own that reached as high as it was possible to reach in Britain, and that could never, for one specific reason, end in marriage. The story of how these two ended up married at all opens out into 4 people, and two romances running at the same table, in the same small circle, at the same charged moment in the early 1970s. To see how the wrong pairs became the right ones, the film has to lay all four of them out at once. Chapter 3. Two romances at the same table. While Camilla waited for Andrew, Andrew was courting the Queen's only daughter, and Camilla had fallen for the heir to the throne. The early 1970s gave this story its strangest and most revealing shape. A love quadrangle in which all four people were, for a season, matched with exactly the wrong partner. Andrew Parker Bowles was involved with Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter. Camilla Shand was involved with Charles, Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne. The two people who would marry each other were, at that very moment, each entangled with a member of the royal family, and the symmetry is so neat that it would seem invented if it were not on the record. It is the kind of arrangement of the pieces that history occasionally produces and no novelist would dare. Andrew's romance with Princess Anne dated from around 1970. He was a dashing household cavalry officer, precisely the sort of man who might catch a princess's eye, and by several accounts he did. But it could never become a marriage, and the reason is the hinge the whole story keeps returning to. Andrew was a Roman Catholic. The biographer Sally Bedell Smith has observed that the relationship could not have been very serious, in part because Andrew's Catholicism placed a marriage beyond reach. At that time, the rules and anxieties surrounding the succession, reaching back to the Act of Settlement of 1701, made a Catholic husband for a princess close to the throne a constitutional impossibility. His faith, which had shaped his schooling and his family and his whole sense of himself, now quietly closed a door that might otherwise have led him into the royal family itself. He could ride beside the sovereign. He could not marry her daughter. At the same moment, in the same small world, Camilla had met Charles. The two of them met around 1970 to 1971 at the Polo and through a mutual friend named Lucia Santa Cruz. They were young and easy together, and Camilla, warm and funny and entirely without airs, was unlike the deferential girls usually steered toward the prince. She teased him. She made him laugh. She treated him as a man rather than an institution, and for a young heir surrounded all his life by deference, that was a rare and intoxicating thing. For a while, it was a real romance, tender and promising. Then, in early 1973, Charles went to sea. He was a serving naval officer, and his deployment aboard the ship Minerva in the Caribbean took him away for months at exactly the wrong time. The distance opened a gap, and into that gap, the older, on and off attachment reasserted itself, because Andrew was still there. His romance with Princess Anne had no future, and when it faded, he drifted back toward Camilla, the woman who had never stopped waiting for him. And Camilla, with Charles at sea and no promise from a prince who was in no position to make one, turned back toward the man she had loved for years. The wrong pairs began, slowly, to sort themselves into the pairs that history would record. Anne would go one way, Charles would go another. Andrew and Camilla would marry. The music stopped, and when it did, the four of them were standing beside partners none of them had begun the decade expecting. It helps to remember what Charles was in those years, because it explains why Camilla could love him and still marry another man. He was young, uncertain, and hemmed in on every side by duty, a naval officer doing his service like any other young man of his generation, and not yet the fixed and famous figure he would later become. There was no question, in the early 1970s, of the heir to the throne marrying a young woman who had already been attached to another man in their shared circle. The expectations around a future king's bride were rigid and unforgiving, and Camilla, Warm and worldly, and a little older in experience than her years, did not fit them. So the romance that might, in another life, have led somewhere, was quietly understood by both of them to be a thing of the moment, lovely and doomed, and when the Navy took him away, it was allowed to lapse. Neither of them could have guessed that it would return, years later, and outlast 2 marriages. The timing of it all is worth laying out plainly, because the closeness of the dates tells its own story. Andrew and Camilla married in the summer of 1973. That same autumn, on the 14th of November 1973, Princess Anne married Captain Mark Phillips, barely 4 months after Andrew married Camilla. 2 of Andrew's great romances, his own with Anne and Camilla's with Charles, resolved in opposite directions inside a single year, as though the whole tangle had been shaken out and allowed to fall into its final arrangement. He lost a princess in the spring and gained a wife in the summer, and watched the princess marry another man in the autumn. She lost, for the moment, a prince and gained a husband. And the prince she lost would not stay lost. Here the psychology of the 4 becomes the engine of everything that follows. Charles had lost Camilla when the Navy took him to sea, and the film leaves his feelings on it where the record leaves them, unstated. Camilla married the man she had loved longest, while carrying a tenderness for the man she had loved most recently. Andrew married the constant woman who had waited for him, while knowing, as everyone in that world knew, that his own restless nature had not changed and would not change. 4 young people, 2 royal and 2 not, walked into their separate futures already carrying the attachments that would later collide, each of them making a choice that felt, at the time, like the sensible arrangement of a difficult situation. What makes this more than gossip is what it reveals about the machinery of that class. These 4 were no strangers thrown together by chance. They were a tight, intermarried circle in which everyone knew everyone, in which a prince and a princess could court the same young Catholic officer and the same young wine merchant's daughter, in which the introductions came through brothers and mutual friends and polo grounds. It was a world small enough that the same handful of people could rearrange themselves into new pairs without ever having to leave the room. A world where the guest list at one wedding was the guest list at the next, and where a former lover sat comfortably in the pews. And it was a world with a long, unwritten understanding about what married people were allowed to do once the vows were said, provided they were discreet about it, an understanding that the 4 of them had absorbed since childhood. There is something almost airless about how small that world was, and the film should let the audience feel it. The same few hundred families owned the same few thousand acres, hunted the same country, married one another's cousins, and christened one another's children. A young man and a young woman could not fall in and out of love in that world without half of it knowing, because half of it had been at school with them, or shared a godparent, or stood in the same paddock at the same point to point. Privacy, in such a world, was not the absence of watchers. It was an agreement among the watchers to say nothing. That agreement is the thing the Parker Bowles marriage would lean on for 21 years, and it is the thing that, one day, would be taken away, all at once, by people who had never agreed to it. That understanding is the thing the whole marriage would run on. But first, there had to be a marriage, and the way it was made is the perfect overture to everything the union would become. Andrew Parker Bowles did not, in the end, propose to Camilla Shand because he could no longer bear to be without her. By the biographer's account, he proposed because 2 fathers, tired of watching their children drift, had made it impossible for him to do anything else. Chapter 4. The wedding 2 fathers arranged. The marriage did not begin with a proposal. It began with a notice in the Times that neither of them had approved. By the early months of 1973, Camilla had waited on Andrew for close to 7 years, and the two fathers had evidently decided that the waiting had gone on long enough. According to the biographer Sally Bedell Smith, Derek Parker Bowles and Bruce Shand simply took the matter into their own hands. They published an engagement notice in the Times announcing the betrothal of their children, without, in Bedell Smith's account, the couple themselves having settled it. As Bedell Smith puts it, his hand publicly forced, Andrew proposed to his girlfriend of nearly 7 years. The details should be flagged as the biographer's account rather than documentary record. But it is a remarkable one, and it is the truest possible opening for a film about arrangement. The marriage that the country would read as devotion began as a maneuver by two fathers to settle a drifting son. Think for a moment about what that notice did and how completely it worked. In the world of 1970s England, an engagement announced in the Times was a public fact, and a public fact of that kind could not easily be unmade. To see it printed and then to walk away would have humiliated both families, insulted the bride, and branded Andrew a cad in the one circle whose opinion he valued above all others. The fathers understood this perfectly. They did not persuade Andrew. They boxed him in, using the machinery of their own class, the newspaper of record and the code of honour, to close off every exit but the altar. And Andrew, boxed in, did the honourable thing, which was to propose to the woman he had kept waiting for 7 years. It was honourable, and it was also, in a sense, involuntary, and the marriage carried that double character from its very first day. A man walked to the altar because he could not, without disgrace, walk anywhere else. The wedding itself, on the 4th of July 1973, was the society wedding of the season, and the guest list is where its meaning lives. It was held at the Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks in a Roman Catholic service before a reported 800 guests. The bride wore the Camilla Shand tiara, an heirloom of her mother's family. The soldiers of Andrew's own world filled the chapel, the uniforms and the medals and the great families of hunting England, and the whole occasion had the glitter of a match that everyone approved of and no one thought to question. It looked, that afternoon, like the happy ending to a long courtship, the reward for 7 years of a young woman's patience. And the royal presence was extraordinary for a marriage between two people who were, after all, commoners. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, attended. Princess Anne attended, the groom's own former girlfriend, sitting in the pews 4 months before her own wedding, a detail so pointed that it could only exist in a world entirely comfortable with such things. Princess Margaret attended. The wider aristocracy turned out in force. When the senior women of the royal family sit in a barracks chapel to watch a cavalry officer marry a wine merchant's daughter, the message is unmistakable. These two people were being folded, publicly and permanently, into the innermost circle of British life. But one figure was absent, and the absence matters, because it is a fact easy to state wrongly and important to state right. Queen Elizabeth II did not attend the wedding. The royal guests were the Queen Mother, Princess Anne, and Princess Margaret. The sovereign herself was not among them. It is the kind of distinction the palace understood intimately, the difference between members of the family gracing an occasion and the monarch herself endorsing it. And the story should keep it exact, rather than reaching for a grander claim that the record will not support. The Queen was not there. Her mother, her daughter, and her sister were. Even with that correction, the meaning of the day is not diminished. The endorsement given was real, and it was public. Whatever the marriage later became, and it would become something no one in that chapel could have predicted, the establishment had blessed it in the open, before 800 witnesses, on a July afternoon in the heart of ceremonial London. That blessing would matter later, because it was the public contract against which every private betrayal would be measured, the bright surface over which the hidden marriage would run. The Guards' Chapel itself was the right setting for such a contract, a place stitched into the ceremonial life of the army and the crown at Wellington Barracks, a short march from the palace. To marry there, in uniform, before the senior women of the royal family, was to marry inside the institution Andrew served, at the very heart of ceremonial London. It gave the wedding a weight that an ordinary society marriage would never have carried. This was not merely two families joining. It was the establishment gathering to bless one of its own, an officer of the sovereign's bodyguard taking a wife, and the choice of chapel said as much about the marriage's public meaning as the guest list did. Everything about the day was designed to be seen and remembered, and it would be, for exactly the wrong reasons, 2 decades later. Hold the scale of the day in view, because the film will return to it at the very end, and the contrast is the whole point. 800 guests filled the Guards' Chapel. The Queen Mother was there. Princess Anne was there, 4 months from her own wedding. Princess Margaret was there. The bride was 25, the groom 33. The two families between them carried a military cross and a bar, a baronetcy, an earldom in the bloodline, and centuries of English Catholic gentry. It was, by every outward measure, a triumph, the crowning of a long courtship and the happy ending to 7 years of waiting. And yet the film's audience already knows what the guests either did not know or would never say. The groom was a serial womanizer whose nature the marriage would not change. The bride carried a tenderness for a prince who was, that very summer, at sea. The wedding was a genuine public contract, sealed with genuine feeling and genuine hope, and it was also, from its first hour, built directly over a fault line. The vows were real. The love, in its way, was real. But the thing being founded was not the simple marriage the 800 guests believed they were witnessing, and the ground beneath it was already moving. There is one more thing to see in that wedding, and it is the thing the whole rest of the story depends on. A wedding of that kind, in that world, was a promise made to an audience. The 800 guests were not merely spectators. They were witnesses to a contract, and their presence bound the couple to keep it, or at least to keep the appearance of it. When the Queen Mother and 2 princesses sat in those pews, they were lending the weight of the crown to the appearance, and that weight would hold the appearance in place for 2 decades. The wedding was the moment the appearance was created, in full public view, with the grandest possible witnesses. Everything the marriage later hid, it hid behind the memory of that afternoon, and the grander the wedding, the deeper the shadow it could cast over what came after. For a few years, though, the fault line stayed quiet. Andrew and Camilla set up home, had children, and settled into the busy, horse-filled country life they had both been raised for. To the world, the golden couple were exactly what they appeared to be, the handsome officer and his cheerful county wife, fixtures of the hunt and the paddock and the church. It would take almost no time at all for the private truth to begin its slow work beneath the public one. And when it did, it would not announce itself with a crisis or a scene. It would simply, quietly, become the way the marriage was lived. Chapter 5. The marriage nobody would name. Within a few years of the wedding, both of them were unfaithful, and the strangest part is that both of them let it stand. The public marriage was flawless. The private marriage settled, within a few years, into something the couple lived every day, and the country would not learn about for 2 decades. To describe it honestly, the story must move carefully, because the 2 people at its centre are the reigning queen and a man still living, and every private claim has to be handed to the biographer who made it rather than spoken in the narrator's own voice. This is a marriage that must be described through other people's testimony, and the film keeps that discipline from the first sentence to the last. Here is what the biographers say. Andrew Parker Bowles, by the accepted accounts, was a serial adulterer across the length of the marriage. Penny Junor, in her book, The Duchess, published in 2017, sets out a husband whose womanizing was more or less continuous, a pattern rather than an episode. Tina Brown, in the Palace Papers, published in 2022, tells the same story, and her account carries a named witness who spoke on the record. This is the testimony of biographers, and the film treats it as exactly that. An account built by writers with sources, never a fact the narrator can prove from a document. What the record supports is not a single affair, but a way of living, a man whose reputation with women had preceded the wedding and did not end at it, and who carried that reputation, by these accounts, through the whole of the marriage. And Camilla, by the same accepted narrative, was not idle in her own heart. She had loved Charles before she married, and towards the end of the 1970s, that attachment revived. The prince and the young wife of the cavalry officer found their way back to one another, and the tenderness that had been interrupted by a naval deployment and a forced engagement became, over time, a standing feature of both their lives. It would survive her husband's presence in the marriage. It would survive, later, the prince's own marriage to a young bride the whole world adored. The revived attachment, by the biographer's telling, began around 1978 or 1979, roughly 5 years into the Parker-Bowles marriage, and it did not fade with time. If anything, it deepened. Now comes the single most important claim in the entire story, and it must be flagged as the biographer's interpretation every time it appears, because the film's credibility depends on it. Andrew is reported to have tolerated his wife's relationship with the prince, and in some tellings to have tacitly approved of it, in part because his own conduct left him no ground on which to object. The film must never harden this into fact. No source supports a date for when Andrew first knew about Charles, and the story invents none. The exact degree of his knowledge and his consent, at any given moment across 21 years, is interpretation and inference, and, in places, gossip. And it is presented as precisely that, never as something the record can settle. A responsible telling names its sources and marks the edges of what they can support, and this is one of those edges. What can be said plainly is the shape of the thing, and the shape is clear enough. Two people, married to each other, each carrying on outside the marriage, each aware in general terms of the other, and neither willing to bring it to an end. That is the arrangement. It is the quiet machine at the center of this film, and it ran for the better part of 2 decades without breaking down. It asks the audience to hold two ideas at once, that these two people were unfaithful to their vows, and that they were, at the same time, genuinely fond of one another. Both were true, and the truth of both together is what makes the marriage so hard to judge, and so much more interesting than the scandal the tabloids eventually made of it. The psychology of it is where the sympathy lives, and the film should refuse the easy verdict at every turn. It would be simple to call Andrew a cad and Camilla a schemer and be done with the pair of them. But the truth is gentler and stranger than the caricature. By every account, these two people liked each other. They were friends before they were spouses, and they remained friends long after they stopped being spouses. They raised their children together and kept a warm house and stayed fond of one another for the rest of their lives. The infidelity, real and mutual, ran alongside a genuine affection rather than in place of it. This was a marriage that had decided, somewhere in its early years, that fidelity was the one promise it could not keep, and that everything else, the friendship, the family, the loyalty, the shared life, was worth keeping anyway. It was a private treaty about which promises mattered most, struck quietly and honoured for 21 years. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to imagine two cold and calculating people coolly agreeing to deceive the world. The reality was warmer and more human, and, in a way, more troubling for being so. These were not villains plotting. They were two people who had married for real reasons, who found that neither of them could keep the central vow, and who chose, rather than tear the household apart, to keep everything else and quietly let that one thing go. Many marriages of their class had made the same choice for generations. What made theirs different was only that one of the lovers was the heir to the throne, and that the age of privacy was about to end. The phrase the film keeps returning to, aware in general terms, is doing a great deal of quiet work, and the audience should understand why. In a marriage of this kind, knowledge was rarely a matter of confession or confrontation. It was atmospheric, a thing understood rather than spoken, absorbed from 100 small signs and never once put into words. Andrew did not need to be told, and Camilla did not need to tell him, and neither of them needed to say aloud what both of them knew. That is how the code worked. It ran on a shared silence so complete that the participants themselves could half forget they were keeping a secret at all, because the secret was simply the water they swam in. This is why the biographers hedge, and why the film hedges with them. The exact contents of that silence, who knew precisely what and precisely when, are unrecoverable, because the whole point of the arrangement was that these things were never fixed in words that could later be quoted. And there is a further reason the film keeps its distance, plainer and more practical. The two people at the centre of this marriage are alive, and one of them wears a crown. A biographer may speculate, may weigh sources, may print a named witness and let the reader judge. A documentary that means to be fair has a stricter duty to report what the biographers have said, to mark it as their claim, and to refuse to launder interpretation into fact simply because it makes a cleaner story. The restraint is not timidity. It is the only honest way to tell a story whose central figures cannot answer back and whose private truth was, by design, never written down. Look at the arithmetic of the arrangement, and its durability becomes the thing that most needs explaining. The couple married in the summer of 1973. The Charles attachment revived around 1978 to 1979, roughly 5 years in. It endured, on and off, through the whole of the 1980s, surviving the prince's wedding in 1981 and the years that followed. Andrew's own affairs, by the biographers telling, ran more or less throughout the marriage. 2 children were raised inside it. 21 years would pass before the marriage ended in law. A weaker union would have shattered in a single season under half that strain. This one held, and its holding is the mystery the next chapter exists to solve. Because the durability was never an accident of 2 unusual personalities. It grew out of a system, a code, a whole inherited way of managing exactly this situation that the 2 of them had absorbed from the world that raised them. They did not invent the arrangement. They inherited it, along with the houses and the horses and the faith, and they operated it as their parents and grandparents had operated it before them. Why the Parker Bowles marriage held for 21 years is a question the 2 personalities alone cannot answer. The answer lies in the machine they were both standing inside, a machine centuries old, built for precisely this purpose, and it is worth taking apart piece by piece. Chapter 6. The code that held it together. The tolerance was a machine, centuries old, built to let marriages like theirs quietly survive. The arrangement did not appear from nowhere, and the two people inside it did not invent it. They inherited it. The world Andrew and Camilla came from, the landed, titled, horse-loving upper reaches of English society, had for generations treated the discreet affair within an upper-class marriage as an accepted feature of the institution, rather than a scandal that destroyed it. It was a code of separate bedrooms and mutual silence, of appearances kept up for the sake of family and faith and position, designed precisely to let a marriage survive what would sink an ordinary household. The Parker Bowles marriage ran on that code, and it stands as one of its last and most famous case studies, perhaps the very last, to be lived so completely before the modern world made it impossible. The code had rules, unwritten but perfectly understood by everyone raised inside it. Discretion, above all. Never embarrass the family in public. Keep the household intact and the children provided for. Present a united face to the world and conduct private business privately, behind thick walls in the country, where no one who mattered would ever speak of it. Within those walls, a great deal was permitted, and everyone in that world knew it, and almost nobody said it aloud. It was a technology of marriage, a way of managing human appetite without wrecking the structures that appetite threatened. And it had worked for the English aristocracy for a very long time, through generations of marriages that looked, from the outside, entirely serene. It is easy, from the vantage of a later and more romantic age, to find such a code cynical. But it grew from a particular understanding of what marriage among the great was for. In that world, a marriage was not, first of all, a romance. It was an alliance, a joining of families and lands and names, a vehicle for children and inheritance and continuity. Love was welcome where it came, and often it did come, but it was not the load the marriage was built to bear. Once that is understood, the code of tolerated infidelity looks less like license and more like realism, a hard-eyed acceptance that two people bound together for reasons of family might not remain perfectly in love, and a set of quiet arrangements to keep the alliance intact when they did not. It asked for discretion rather than passion, and in return, it offered stability, and for centuries, a great many people took that bargain willingly. For Andrew and Camilla, the code was reinforced by a second force, and that force was faith. Andrew was a Roman Catholic from an old Catholic family, married in a Catholic service at the Guards' Chapel. For a Catholic of that generation and that background, divorce was a grave matter, not a convenience to be reached for when a marriage cooled, but a rupture of something the Church held sacred. This is one of the quiet reasons the arrangement was preferable to an ending. To divorce was to break a vow the faith regarded as unbreakable, and to wound a family that took its Catholicism seriously. To stay, and to manage the marriage privately, was to keep faith with both, at least in outward form. The very Catholicism that had barred Andrew from marrying Princess Anne now helped bind him to the marriage he had made instead. And the irony of that is one the film should let the audience sit with. There were plainer reasons too, and the film should name them without cynicism, because they are the ordinary human reasons that keep any difficult marriage together. The children were young, and young children are a powerful argument for holding a household intact. The two families were intertwined, their fathers friends, their worlds overlapping at every hunt and every dinner and every point to point. And, most importantly, the arrangement cost neither partner what they most valued. Andrew kept his marriage, his standing, his royal friendships, and his personal freedom. Camilla kept a settled family home and the affection of the man she had loved longest. Neither of them was being asked to surrender the thing that mattered most to them. An arrangement that lets both parties keep what they care about is an arrangement that lasts, and this one lasted for 21 years. Set this against the law and the long history behind it, and the picture widens into something far larger than a private accommodation. The Catholic anxieties that shaped Andrew's life reach back centuries to the Act of Settlement of 1701, which fixed the Protestant succession and made Catholics near the throne a constitutional problem to be managed. For 300 years, English public life had been arranged around keeping Catholicism at a careful distance from the crown. Andrew, a Catholic officer in the sovereign's own bodyguard, lived inside that long history, close enough to the throne to serve it and to be godson, by report, to a queen, and yet barred by his faith from marrying into it. The same faith that closed the royal door held the marital one shut. He belonged, and he was excluded at the same time, and the arrangement was the shape his life took inside that ancient contradiction. There is a deep irony here, and it is the irony the whole film turns on. The code of tolerated infidelity was, in its own strange way, a conservative instrument. It existed to preserve marriages, to preserve families, to preserve the appearance of order in a class that valued order above almost everything else. It was never a license for chaos. It worked as a mechanism for containing chaos, for allowing human beings to be human without letting the structures collapse around them. Andrew and Camilla were not rebels against their world. They were its faithful children, using the very tools their class had handed them to hold together a marriage that a stricter society would have forced them either to keep in misery or to end in scandal. They chose a third path, the one their world had built for exactly this purpose, and they walked it for 2 decades without stumbling. The Catholic thread deserves a moment of its own, because it ran deeper in Andrew than a simple matter of Sunday observance. The old English Catholic families carried a particular history in their blood, the memory of centuries in which their faith had made them suspect, barred from office, watched, and sometimes worse. That history bred a certain inwardness, a habit of keeping one's own counsel, of not parading private matters before a Protestant world that had once persecuted them. A man raised in that tradition did not air his marriage in public. He did not complain, did not confess, did not seek the sympathy of strangers. He kept the family's business inside the family, as his ancestors had kept the faith inside the house when it was dangerous to do otherwise. Andrew's lifelong silence, later, about the most humiliating scandal of the age, was not only the discretion of his class. It was also the deep reticence of his faith, the instinct of a people who had learned across generations that some things are best not said aloud. And the mechanics of a separate life were, in that world, entirely practical to arrange. Great houses had many rooms. Country life offered 100 honest reasons to be apart. The hunt, the regiment, the season in London, the visit to friends, the horse to be seen at a distant show. A marriage could be lived at arm's length without anyone outside ever noticing a thing, because being apart was simply the texture of upper-class life, and no one thought to read a scandal into a husband and wife who kept busy separate diaries. The code did not need elaborate deception. It needed only the ordinary machinery of a certain kind of life, and that machinery was already there, humming quietly, ready to be used. And so the marriage held, ordinary year after ordinary year, because everyone with a stake in it wanted it to hold. The two families wanted it. The church wanted it. The couple themselves wanted it. Later, the palace would want it too, prizing the loyalty of the officer at its centre and grateful for the discretion of everyone involved. A whole quiet consensus of people and institutions leaned in the same direction, toward keeping the appearance intact, and a consensus that broad is enormously strong. It would take a force from outside, larger than any of them, to break it. That force was coming. but it was still years away. And in the meantime, the Parker Bowleses did exactly what the arrangement had been built to allow. They lived an entirely normal, entirely happy-looking family life in 2 beautiful houses with 2 children and a great many horses in the deep green heart of the English countryside. Chapter 7. The uniform and the family it hid. In public, he was the model of loyal service, and the household behind him was warm, busy, and entirely real. The Parker Bowles family lived at 2 Wiltshire houses, and both are worth seeing clearly, because the ordinary life inside them is one of the reasons the marriage endured. They lived first at Bolehide Manor, a gabled Elizabethan house near Allington, and later at Middlewick House near Corsham, a handsome Georgian place with paddocks and stabling suited to a hunting, horse-centred life. These were not cold houses run for show. They were full of children and dogs and ponies, of weekends and hunt mornings, and the whole busy apparatus of English country family life, the boots in the hall, the horses in the yard, the long lunches that ran into the afternoon, and the mud that came in with everyone. By the accepted accounts, the Parker Bowleses were affectionate, engaged parents who kept a warm and lively home, and the warmth was not a performance for visitors. It was the daily texture of the place. There were 2 children, and they were the beating heart of the household. Tom Parker Bowles was born on the 18th of December, 1974. He would grow up to be a well-known food writer, and his godfather was the Prince of Wales, a detail that tells you how tightly this family was woven into the royal world, even at the christening font. Laura, later Laura Lopes, was born on the 19th of April 1978. The children were raised in comfort and affection, in the country life their parents had both been born to, surrounded by animals and cousins, and the reassuring rhythm of the rural year, the hunting season, and the summer shows, and the long school holidays. The private arrangement ran underneath that life, but it did not hollow it out. The family was real. The love of these 2 parents for their children was real. The house was a home in every sense that a child would understand. This is the part of the story that resists the tabloid version most stubbornly, and the film should insist on it, because it is where the truth is most easily lost. The arrangement was never a marriage of cold strangers pretending for the cameras. It was a functioning, affectionate household, with a private understanding threaded quietly through it. The domestic normality was the very thing the arrangement had been built to protect, never a contradiction of it. The whole point of the code, the discretion and the separate lives and the silence, was to keep exactly this safe, the home, the children, the shared table, from the disruption that open honesty would have caused. The secret existed in order to preserve the family, and for 2 decades it did preserve it. The children grew up in a happy house. That the house also held a secret does not cancel the happiness, and an honest film holds both facts together. Alongside that home ran Andrew's other life, the public one, the life of loyal service to the Crown, and his career is worth following in full because its shape is the visible half of the marriage and because it is studied with a ceremonial closeness to the monarchy that makes his private position so extraordinary. He had been adjutant of the Royal Horse Guards from 1967 to 1969, and of the Blues and Royals from 1969 to 1970. He was promoted Major on the 31st of December 1971. In 1972, he led B Squadron during Operation Motorman in Northern Ireland, the largest British Army operation since the Suez Crisis, mounted to retake the barricaded no-go areas of Belfast and Londonderry. This was real soldiering, dangerous and serious, in the hardest posting the British Army had at the time, and he did it, by every account, with competence and nerve. His rise continued through the very years the arrangement was settling into place, and the two lives climbed side by side, the public and the private, each hidden from the other's world. In 1979 and 1980, he served as senior military liaison officer to Lord Soames in Rhodesia during the fraught transition to a new nation, and he received a Queen's Commendation for bravery in 1980. He commanded the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment from 1981 to 1983. He was appointed to the Order of the British Empire in its military division in 1984, and from 1987 to 1990, he held one of the most intimate ceremonial offices in the entire royal household, Silver Stick in Waiting to the Queen, the officer who rides close to the sovereign on great state occasions, near enough to reach out and steady her horse. Hold that scale in view, because the closeness to the crown is the thing that makes the private truth so strange, and the list of it deserves to be spoken in full. A commission into the sovereign's own bodyguard at 20. A ride in the Grand National in 1969. Command of a squadron in the largest army operation since Suez in 1972. A Queen's Commendation for bravery in 1980. Command of the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment from 1981. The Order of the British Empire in 1984. Silver Stick in Waiting from 1987. He was promoted brigadier on the 30th of June 1990 and served as director of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps until he retired in 1994 after 34 years in uniform. It is one of the most decorated ceremonial careers of its generation, a life of service written in medals and appointments. It is worth seeing what the office of Silver Stick in Waiting actually meant, because the closeness it implied is almost hard to credit, given what the film has already told the audience. By Andrew's day, the office was ceremonial, but the closeness it carried was entirely real. On the great state occasions, the trooping of the colour, the state openings, the processions, the Silver Stick rode at the sovereign's very shoulder, one of the handful of men trusted to be nearest her person in public. There is no more visible sign of a monarch's trust than that. And Andrew held it for 3 years, from 1987 to 1990, at the very height of the private arrangement, riding beside the Queen, while her son was a fixture in his marriage. Few images in the whole story hold its contradiction so tightly in a single frame. The soldiering, too, was real, and the film should not let the ceremony obscure it. Operation Motorman, which Andrew helped carry out in 1972, was the largest British military operation since the Suez Crisis, a vast and dangerous undertaking to retake the barricaded areas of Belfast and Londonderry from the men who had sealed them off. This was not parade ground work. It was the hardest and most fraught duty the army had at the time, in a conflict that would grind on for decades, and Andrew led a squadron through it. The man carried genuine weight, earned a Queen's Commendation for bravery, and rose steadily to brigadier. Whatever the private truth of his marriage, his public life was a serious life, honourably lived, and the tragedy of the story is partly that the serious public man would be remembered, in the end, mostly for the private thing done to him. Set that record of decorated service beside the private truth the film has been tracing, and the collision of the two is what gives the whole story its peculiar charge. Here was a man the crown trusted with its ceremonies, its regiments, and its person. A man who had earned that trust honestly through decades of hard and dangerous work. And here, at the same time, was a marriage whose private shape the same crown would have found deeply awkward to look at directly. The two truths sat inside one life, held apart by the discipline of a whole class, and the man carried both without ever letting either disturb the other in public. The irony sits in plain sight, and the film should let it breathe rather than shout it. For years, The public half of this marriage was a performance of loyal service to the very crown, whose heir was, privately, part of the arrangement. Andrew rode close to the sovereign as silver stick in waiting, while, in the deep countryside of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire, the sovereign's own son was a fixture in the officer's marriage. The uniform was the visible truth, admired at every state occasion, saluted and photographed. The arrangement was the hidden one, known only within the circle and spoken of by no one. A man cannot be more loyal to an institution or more entangled with it than Andrew Parker Bowles was, and few men have ever carried so public a role and so private a secret at the same time. And the two lives, the service and the accommodation, were about to be pushed physically closer together because the Prince of Wales was about to buy a house, and the house he chose sat almost on the Parker Bowles' own doorstep. Chapter 8. The Prince Who Moved Next Door. In the summer of 1980, the heir to the throne bought a house a short drive from her own front gate. In August 1980, the Duchy of Cornwall bought Highgrove House near Tetbury in Gloucestershire for a sum believed to be between £800,000 and £1 million. On a map, it was a modest thing, a country house among many country houses in a green and prosperous corner of England. In the geometry of this story, it was everything. Highgrove sits in the Duke of Beaufort's hunt country, the same hunting world the Parker Bowleses moved in, only a short drive from their homes. The Prince of Wales had installed himself inside Camilla's own county and her own hunt, within easy reach of the woman he had lost to a naval posting 7 years before. And geography, in a story like this, is destiny. The proximity was the point, and it changed the very nature of the arrangement. A lapsed romance conducted across distance is one thing, a matter of letters and rare meetings, easily allowed to cool and fade. A romance in which the two people ride the same country, attend the same meets, share the same friends, and can reach one another in half an hour is quite another. Highgrove made the attachment convenient in a way it had never been before, and convenience, sustained over years, hardens into permanence. Camilla even recommended the garden designer Lanning Roper to Charles in 1981, a small domestic detail that shows how naturally the two households had begun to overlap. The prince's celebrated garden and the officer's marriage were, in a sense, being tended by the same hands, and the county saw nothing strange in it, because in that world, neighbours helped neighbours and everyone hunted together. The following summer, the whole country watched the prince marry someone else. On the 29th of July, 1981, before a global television audience, Charles married Diana. She was young, luminous, and adored, and the nation poured its hope into her as into no bride in living memory. It was sold to the world as a fairy tale, and the world believed it. And here, the film must be careful and fair, and hold strictly to the source. There is a widely reported account, given by Diana herself through the writer Andrew Morton, that about 2 weeks before the wedding, she discovered a bracelet the prince had commissioned for Camilla, engraved with 2 private nicknames. It is Diana's allegation, told in her own later account, and the prince has never confirmed it. The film reports it as her account and holds it lightly, a passing shadow across the wedding rather than a proven fact, because that is all the record will bear. What matters for this story is the effect the royal marriage had on the arrangement, which was, in the end, very little. The attachment between Charles and Camilla, by the accepted biographer's account, revived and endured through the 1980s, and is said to have resumed in earnest around 1986, some years into the prince's marriage. 2 marriages now contained the same secret. The Parker Bowles arrangement, once a private matter between a husband and a wife who tolerated one another's affairs, had become entangled with the marriage of the future king, and the stakes of the whole thing had risen beyond anything the old code had been designed to carry. The code had been built to protect one household from scandal. Now it stretched across two households, and one of them belonged to the man who would one day be crowned, and whose every move the world watched. Two households now shared a single secret, and that doubled the danger in a way the old code had never been built to handle. A secret kept by two people in one marriage is a manageable thing. A secret that stretches across two marriages, one of them belonging to the heir to the throne and watched by the whole world, is a far more fragile arrangement because it depends on the discretion of many more people and reaches into a life that could never truly be private. The Prince of Wales could not move without notice. His marriage was public property in a way the Parker Bowles marriage had never been. And so, the moment the two were entangled, the officer's quiet arrangement was hostage to the fortunes of the most scrutinized marriage in the world, and when that marriage began to fail in public, there was no way to keep the Parker Bowles secret from failing with it. There is a reported moment from 1989 that the film can use, carefully and briefly, as a sign of the pressure building beneath the surface. Diana is said, in her own later account, to have confronted Camilla directly at a party, telling her, in effect, that she knew exactly what was going on between her and Charles. It is Diana's account, flagged as hers, and it belongs to her story more than to this one, so the film touches it and moves on. But it is a crack of light under a closed door, a first sign that the arrangement, so carefully kept for so long, was becoming harder and harder to keep. The people inside it still controlled the appearance. That control was beginning, very slightly, to slip, and once it slipped, it would not be recovered, because the young woman at the heart of the new marriage had never agreed to the old rules and never would. The hunting world that Highgrove sat inside is worth understanding, because it was the medium through which the whole thing flowed. The Duke of Beaufort's hunt was one of the grandest and oldest in England, and the country it rode over was a dense web of the same families, the same houses, the same long friendships that had shaped Andrew and Camilla's whole lives. To hunt that country was to move constantly among the same people, to share the same fields and the same dinners and the same weekends, week after week, through the season. When the Prince of Wales bought a house in the middle of that country, he did not merely acquire a convenient address. He joined a world, Camilla's world, and once inside it, he was among her friends and her neighbours, as a matter of course, welcome at the same gatherings, riding the same country. The geography did the work that no arrangement of meetings ever could. It made the two of them simply part of the same daily landscape, and the contrast with the wedding of 1981 only sharpened the strangeness. The whole nation had watched Diana marry the prince before a vast television audience, the largest and most adored royal bride of the century, the fairy tale made flesh. The country believed in that marriage utterly, poured its hopes into it, bought the plates and the tea towels, and wept in the streets. And all the while, by the accepted biographer's account, the older attachment endured quietly in the Gloucestershire countryside, at Highgrove, and in the hunt, unseen and unsuspected by the millions who had cheered the bride. The gap between what the nation believed and what was quietly true had never been wider, and it would take more than a decade for that gap to close in the most painful way imaginable. Consider the position by the end of the 1980s, because it is a portrait of an arrangement at its most extended and most dangerous. The Parker Bowles marriage had lasted more than 15 years. Andrew was silverstick in waiting to the sovereign, a decorated officer with a Queen's Commendation for Bravery and the Order of the British Empire, soon to be a brigadier. Camilla was the settled county wife, mother of two, popular and unglamorous, the last woman the public would ever have suspected of standing at the centre of a national drama. Charles was married, the heir to the throne, the most scrutinized husband in the world. And running underneath all of it, connecting the officer's quiet marriage to the future king's very public one, was an attachment that had survived a naval deployment, a forced engagement, 2 weddings, and more than a decade of years, and that showed no sign of ending. The arrangement had become permanent. It had also become perilous, because it now reached the throne, and because the one thing that had always protected it was beginning to fail. That protection was discretion, the long-standing agreement of the press and the public to leave the private lives of the great alone. For as long as that agreement held, the arrangement was safe, and it had held for the whole of the marriage so far, through 15 years and more of ordinary country life. But the country was changing, and the newspapers were changing with it, growing hungrier and less deferential and more willing to intrude with every passing year. And the long age in which Britain left the private lives of its royal family alone was coming, at last, to its end. Chapter 9. The year the country stopped pretending. For 20 years, the press had looked away, and then, almost all at once, it decided it would not. The Parker Bowles marriage did not end because the affairs began. It ended because the country stopped agreeing to pretend. For the whole of the marriage so far, the private lives of the great had been protected by an unwritten agreement, a deference that kept newspapers respectful and secrets buried and cameras at a polite distance. That deference had held for decades, through the whole of Andrew and Camilla's married life. In the early 1990s, in the space of a very few years, it collapsed, and the collapse took the Parker Bowles arrangement down with it, along with a great deal else besides. What had been safe for 20 years became, almost overnight, the most exposed private life in Britain. To feel the size of the change, remember what the press had been. For most of the 20th century, the British newspapers had treated the royal family with a deference that now seems almost unimaginable. Royal reporters were courtiers as much as journalists. Private lives were private. Editors knew things they never printed, out of a mixture of respect, self-interest, and the sense that some subjects were simply off-limits. That whole understanding, which had protected the Parker Bowles arrangement without either of them having to lift a finger, was built on a shared assumption that the monarchy was owed a certain silence. In the early 1990s, that assumption died, and it died with astonishing speed, and the arrangement had no defense against its dying. The years of that collapse have a name. They are remembered as the War of the Waleses, the public battle between the Prince and Princess of Wales, fought through leaks and books and recordings, that turned the royal family's private misery into national entertainment. It was a war neither Andrew nor Camilla started, and one they could not stop. It was, at bottom, a war about Charles and Diana, about a young woman who felt betrayed and a husband who could not love her, and about the third person standing inside the marriage. But its weapons fell on everyone nearby, and the officer's quiet marriage was dragged into a fight that was really about someone else's unhappiness, and made to bear a share of the blame. The first great blow fell in 1992. In that year, the journalist Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story, a book that put the Charles and Camilla relationship into open print for the first time. The effect was seismic. The attachment that had run privately for well over a decade, tolerated inside the arrangement and known only within the circle, was suddenly on the front pages and in the bookshops and on every breakfast table in the country. The name Camilla Parker Bowles, until then a private matter, became a public one overnight, and it would never be private again. A woman who had spent 20 years as an ordinary county wife, unknown to the wider public and content to stay that way, was made famous in the worst possible manner. as the third person in the most watched marriage in the world. She had done nothing to seek that fame, and she could do nothing to escape it. And from that year forward, she would carry it everywhere she went. The same year brought Squidgygate, a recorded and published telephone call between Diana and a male friend, the first of the intimate royal tapes to reach the public. The idea that private royal telephone calls could be recorded, transcribed, and printed was new and deeply shocking, and it changed the rules of the whole game at a stroke. The old assumption that a private conversation stayed private no longer held for anyone in that family, or anyone married into it, or anyone married alongside it. Suddenly, every intimate word any of them had ever spoken down a telephone line was a potential headline, sitting perhaps on a tape in a newspaper office, waiting to be sold. For a marriage whose entire survival had always depended on privacy, this was the true beginning of the end, though the couple could not yet have known the exact form the end would take. Then, on the 9th of December 1992, the Prime Minister rose in Parliament and announced the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. The most watched marriage in the world had failed, and the failure was confirmed in Parliament from the dispatch box as a matter of state. The royal family's private life was now the business of politicians, splashed across every newspaper, dissected on every television programme, argued over in every pub and at every dinner table in the land. The dam that had held back scrutiny for a generation had broken, and the water was rising fast, and it was rising toward a marriage in the Wiltshire countryside that had done nothing to invite it and could do nothing to escape it. What made it worse for the Parker Bowleses was that they were, in this war, almost entirely passive. They had not sought the exposure. They had not briefed against anyone, had not published a book, had not sat for a secret interview. The great weapons of the War of the Waleses were wielded by others, by a princess fighting for her version of the truth and a palace fighting to contain her. And the Parker Bowles marriage was simply in the blast radius. Camilla's name was used as ammunition in a fight that was not, at its heart, about her marriage at all, but about the failure of a different one. She and Andrew could only watch as their private life was made a weapon in someone else's battle, unable to shape the story, unable to correct it, unable to do anything but endure whatever the next week's papers chose to print. Look at the sequence and the sheer speed of it, because the speed is what overwhelmed the old defences. For close to 20 years, the Parker Bowles arrangement had run quietly, protected by silence and distance and deference. Then, in a single year, 1992, came Morton's book, The Squidgygate Tape, and a separation announced in Parliament. 3 blows in 12 months, each one stripping away a layer of the protection that had made the arrangement possible. The private world that had taken 2 decades to build was being dismantled in public in a matter of months, and the people who had built it could only stand and watch it come apart, without a word to say in their own defence. There was a hunger in the country that the newspapers were feeding and being fed by at once, and it is worth naming, because it is what gave the collapse its force. For a generation, the royal family had been presented as a kind of national fairy tale, remote and gleaming and above reproach. When the cracks appeared, the appetite to see behind the gleam was enormous, and the newspapers discovered that royal misery sold as royal glamour never had. Every revelation drew a larger audience than the last, and the larger the audience, the bolder the next revelation. A market had formed for the private lives of the royal family, and once a market forms, it does not politely close, because the people inside those lives would prefer it to. It grows, and it demands to be fed. and it was fed with the Parker Bowles marriage, among a great deal else. And there was a technological change underneath the cultural one, easy to miss now, but revolutionary then. The scanner and the tape recorder had made private conversation catchable in a way it had never been before. A mobile telephone call could be plucked from the air by an amateur with the right equipment and sold to a newspaper for a fortune. The old privacy had rested partly on the simple fact that private words vanished as they were spoken. Now they could be captured, kept, transcribed, and printed months or years later. For a family whose whole dignity depended on a certain distance, and for a marriage whose survival depended on silence, this was a quiet catastrophe waiting to happen. And it did happen, in the very first weeks of 1993. For Andrew and Camilla, this was a catastrophe they had done almost nothing to cause and could do nothing whatever to halt. The arrangement had always depended on discretion, on the willingness of the outside world to leave private things private. That willingness was gone, and with it went the one condition the marriage most needed to survive. The affairs themselves had never been the danger, because affairs conducted in silence harm no appearance and threaten no marriage that has agreed to permit them. The exposure was the danger, and the exposure, when it came in its most devastating form, would arrive not from a British reporter or a palace leak, but from a magazine on the far side of the world, carrying a recording that would make everything before it seem gentle by comparison. Chapter 10. A tape that crossed the world. The recording that finished the pretense broke first on the far side of the earth, thousands of miles from the palace it concerned. The blow that finished the pretense was a recording, and the film must handle it with absolute care, because the recording's content has no place in this story and will not appear anywhere in it. In January 1993, an intimate private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded some years earlier, was published. For this film, the tape is a dated event and nothing more. Its words, its jokes, its intimate detail appear nowhere here, in the packaging or the script, or a single line of narration. What matters is not what was said. What matters is what the publication did to two people whose whole marriage had been built on the certainty that such things stayed forever behind closed doors. The geography of how it broke is part of the story, and it is a detail often told wrongly, so the film should state it precisely and let the correction stand plainly. The recording did not first appear in a British newspaper. It broke on the far side of the world, in Australia, in the magazine New Idea, and on the 9 network, on the 12th and 13th of January 1993. Only afterwards did it reach the United Kingdom, published there on the 17th of January in the Sunday People and the Sunday Mirror. The common belief that a British paper broke the story first is simply mistaken, and the mistake matters because it shows how the new media worked. A story that would once have been suppressed in Britain could now be published abroad and imported home, and no amount of deference at home could stop it. The pretense that had protected the Parker Bowles marriage for 20 years was ended by a magazine on the other side of the earth. And by the time the British papers printed it, half the country had already heard. Think about what that meant for the two people at the centre of it. For 2 decades, they had kept an appearance, managed a private life, controlled with great care exactly what the world was allowed to see of them. Now a recording of the most intimate kind had been played across Australia and reprinted in Britain and discussed in every household in the land. The control they had exercised for 20 years was gone in a single weekend. There was no putting it back, no statement that could unsay it, no distance great enough to escape it, no country far enough away. Once the tape had crossed the world, the arrangement could no longer be an arrangement, because an arrangement of that kind depends utterly on privacy, and privacy was the one thing these two people would never have again for the rest of their lives. The route the tape took, from Australia to Britain, was itself a sign of how completely the old protections had failed. In an earlier age, a British editor might have quietly declined to publish such a thing, out of deference or distaste or fear, and the matter would have died. But a story published abroad could not be held back at home, because once it was in print anywhere, the British papers could report that it had been published elsewhere and reprint it in the same breath. The deference of the domestic press, even where it survived, had become useless, outflanked by a global media that owed the British monarchy nothing at all. The tape reached Britain by a route the old deference was powerless to close. Once the rest of the world had printed it, no British paper could keep it out, whatever any editor might privately have preferred, and the pretense was finished. The effect on the marriage was total, even though the marriage itself had not changed at all. Andrew and Camilla were the same two people they had been the week before, in the same house, with the same long understanding between them. What had changed was that the whole country now knew, in the most intimate and humiliating detail, what had been private for 20 years. The appearance the marriage had always kept up was now impossible to sustain, because there was no longer anyone left to keep it up for. Everyone already knew. The golden couple of the 1970s wedding had become, in the space of a few days, the most talked about private life in Britain, the subject of jokes and headlines and pity, and there was nothing either of them could do but endure it and wait for the noise to pass, though it would not pass for years. And here the film should rest on Andrew's peculiar position, because it is the very heart of the silenced crown lens. He was the secret keeper, the man on the other side of the door, the officer who had served the crown for more than 30 years while carrying the knowledge of what his own marriage contained. Now that knowledge was public property, chewed over on every front page and in every saloon bar, and he had to endure the exposure of the most private thing in his life without ever once speaking about it. He did not give interviews. He did not defend himself. He did not sell his story, as lesser men in lesser scandals have done for a great deal of money. He absorbed the humiliation in silence, with the discretion his whole class had trained into him since boyhood, and he kept that silence not for a season, but for the rest of his life. The man with the most cause to complain said nothing, and the saying of nothing was itself a kind of dignity, perhaps the last dignity the age still allowed him. There is a cruelty peculiar to this kind of exposure that the film should name plainly, because it is worse than ordinary scandal. An affair discovered is one thing. An intimate conversation, recorded and printed word for word, is another, because it strips away not only the fact of the intimacy, but the privacy of it. The small, foolish, tender things people say only to those they love and never expect the world to hear. To have that played across a continent and reprinted in the Sunday papers is a violation of a particular and terrible kind. It leaves nothing. And Camilla, who until that January had been an almost entirely private person, a country wife whom the wider public would not have recognized in the street, was made overnight into one of the most exposed women in Britain, her private words the property of anyone with a newspaper. She had chosen a private life. The age took it from her in a weekend. For Andrew, the wound was different, but no smaller. He was the husband, and the husband in such a story is offered only humiliation, the oldest and most public humiliation there is. The papers that would not leave the marriage alone had a word for men in his position, and it was not a kind one. He could have answered. He could have sold his side, painted himself the wronged and blameless party, taken the sympathy and the check that the tabloids would happily have handed him. Other men, in smaller scandals, have done exactly that. Andrew did none of it. He met the worst weeks of his life with a silence so complete that it read, to those who understood his world, as the last form of dignity available to a man stripped of every other, and he never once broke it. The scale of the exposure is worth measuring against the scale of the wedding that began the story, because the two scenes are the film's opening and closing brackets. 20 years earlier, 800 guests had filled the guard's chapel, and a queen mother and two princesses had graced the occasion in person. Now, in January 1993, a private recording was crossing two hemispheres, printed first in an Australian magazine on the 12th and 13th of the month, and in two British Sunday papers on the 17th, and read by a nation of tens of millions. The public contract sealed before 800 people had become a private disgrace shared with the whole world. The distance between those two scenes, the chapel full of blessing and the tape full of shame, is the distance the entire film travels, and it took just 20 years to travel it. The tape made the ending inevitable, but it did not, by itself, deliver the final word. That would come the following year, and it would come from the prince himself, in front of a television audience so large that it made every earlier exposure look small. Andrew Parker Bowles had kept his silence through the tape and everything the tape unleashed upon him. He would have to keep it through something harder still, the moment the future king admitted, on camera, to the whole nation, in his own considered words, the thing the officer had lived quietly alongside for 15 years. Chapter 11. The Confession on Television. 13 million people were watching when the Prince of Wales was asked whether he had been faithful, and answered honestly. On the 29th of June 1994, the television channel ITV broadcast a documentary called Charles, the Private Man, The Public Role, made by the writer and broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby. It was meant to show the country a serious man doing serious work, a future king of substance. It was watched by an audience of around 13 million people. And somewhere in its length came the question that the whole country had been waiting years to hear answered, and the answer that would settle, in public and forever, the thing that had been rumoured for a decade and confirmed by a tape the winter before. The prince was asked whether he had been faithful to his wife. He answered that he had been faithful until the marriage had, in his own words, become irretrievably broken down after both of them had tried. It was an admission of adultery, made by the heir to the throne, on camera, to a nation of 13 million viewers. And it required no name to be understood, because the country already knew the name and had known it since the tape. The following day, the prince's private secretary confirmed what everyone had already grasped. The woman was Camilla Parker Bowles, the wife of Brigadier Andrew Parker Bowles, the mother of two children, the popular county wife who had loved the prince since before either of them was married to anyone at all. The confirmation turned a long rumour into an official fact, spoken by the prince's own office, on the record, deliberately. The arrangement was no longer merely exposed by a stolen tape. It was acknowledged, openly, and from the very top, in the plainest possible terms, and there could be no walking it back. For Andrew, the confession was a public branding he had done nothing to earn on camera, and could do nothing to answer. His wife had been named, by the prince's own office, as the woman in the future king's admission of adultery. There is no dignity a society easily grants to the husband in that position, and the newspapers were not inclined to grant him any of it. And yet, Andrew took what dignity there was, which lay entirely in his silence. He said nothing. He blamed no one, in public or, as far as the record shows, in any private complaint that reached the press. He performed no wounded husband for the cameras, and he sold no account of his marriage to the papers who would have paid him a small fortune for it. In an age when almost everyone around the royal family seemed to be talking, briefing, leaking, and selling, the man with the most reason to speak said nothing at all. and kept on saying nothing for decades afterward. It is worth staying a moment with Andrew's silence in that summer, because it is the moral centre of the whole film. His wife had just been named, by the future king's own office, as the woman in a televised confession of adultery watched by 13 million people. There is scarcely a more public humiliation available to a husband, and scarcely a stronger temptation to answer it. The newspapers were desperate for his side and would have paid almost anything for it. A single interview would have recast him as the wronged and blameless man, won him the sympathy of the nation, and made him a great deal of money. He gave them nothing. Not a word, not a briefing, not a wounded look for a waiting camera. In the noisiest royal scandal of the century, the one man with the clearest grievance chose the one response no one could sell or twist, which was total silence, and he held it for the rest of his life. The film can bring in here, carefully and briefly, the material that belongs mostly to Diana's story, but touches this one at its edge. There is Diana's own reported account, given through Andrew Morton, of the bracelet the prince had commissioned for Camilla before his wedding, engraved with 2 private nicknames. There is her reported confrontation of Camilla at a party in 1989, when she is said to have told her rival that she knew what was happening between her and Charles. These are Diana's accounts, flagged as hers and hers alone, and they belong to her film far more than to Andrew's, so the story handles them with a light hand. But they matter here, because they show the same arrangement from the other side, the truth that the accommodation so long tolerated by the officer had become simply unbearable to the young woman who had married into it without ever understanding what she was joining. And that is the quiet tragedy folded inside the scandal, and the film should let the audience feel the whole weight of it. The Parker Bowles arrangement had worked for 20 years because everyone inside it consented to it. Andrew consented. Camilla consented. The 2 families and the church and the whole class around them consented, or at the very least agreed to look the other way and say nothing. The one person who never consented, who was never told, who married into the very middle of it as a teenager and only slowly understood what she had joined, was Diana. The code of tolerated infidelity assumed that everyone involved knew the rules and had chosen to play by them. Diana had never been taught those rules, and her refusal to accept them, her insistence on saying aloud the thing the code demanded be kept forever silent, is a large part of what finally brought the whole structure crashing down. She would not pretend, and once one person at the very centre of it refused to pretend, the pretense could no longer hold for any of them. The documentary that carried the confession is itself worth understanding, because the confession did not come from an ambush or a stolen tape. It came in answer to a direct question, and the prince chose to answer it honestly rather than deny it. The admission of adultery was given inside a serious film about his life and work, an attempt to present him to the country as a man of substance and purpose, which made the moment all the more startling when it came. Whatever one thinks of the decision, it was a decision, made by the future king, to confirm on camera the thing that had been rumoured for a decade. And in confirming it, he confirmed Camilla's place in the story to a national audience, and by extension named her husband as the man whose marriage had contained the future king's mistress for 20 years. For the country, the effect was to make the private public in a way even the tape had not. A stolen recording could be dismissed as an intrusion, a crime against privacy that reflected on the thief as much as the subjects. A confession freely given on television could not be dismissed at all. It was the prince's own word, and it settled the matter. The reaction was enormous, and it fell, as such reactions always do, unevenly. The prince weathered it as heirs to the throne weather most things, protected by the institution around him. Camilla bore the brunt of the public anger, cast as the woman who had come between the beloved princess and her husband. And Andrew, the man who had kept silent through all of it, was left to absorb whatever was left, the pity and the mockery, without a word of complaint. There is a hardness in that silence that the modern eye can miss, and a great cost, too. To say nothing, in the middle of a storm that is tearing at your own name, is to give up every ordinary human comfort, the chance to explain, to be understood, to have your side heard. Andrew surrendered all of it. He let the country think whatever it wished to think, and he carried the private truth of his marriage, whatever it was, entirely alone. That is a kind of strength few men possess, and it is the quiet spine of the whole story. By the summer of 1994, then, the position was clear to everyone in the country. The prince had admitted adultery on television to 13 million viewers. His private secretary had named Camilla the next day. The tape had crossed the world the winter before. The books had been written, the separation announced in Parliament, the rumours confirmed from every direction at once. There was nothing left to expose, because everything had already been exposed, examined, printed, and discussed. The only thing left to do was to end the marriage that had, in truth, ended in all but law many years earlier, and to end it in the one way this family and this class still knew how to do anything at all. Quietly, correctly, and with as little noise as the ruined circumstances would still allow. Chapter 12. Ended in a paragraph. After 21 years, the marriage ended in a few lines of careful, bloodless prose, with no courtroom brawl at all. Andrew Parker Bowles had retired from the Army in 1994, in his final post as Director of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, after 34 years in uniform. His public life of service to the Crown was complete, honourably and fully, every rank earned and every appointment served. His private life, so long protected, had been exposed to the very last detail by the tape and the confession. All that remained was to formalise the ending, and the way it was done is the perfect closing image for a film about arrangement, because even the divorce was managed by the same code that had held the marriage together for 21 years. They had lived by discretion, and they would end by it too, giving the watching world as little as they had ever given it. In January 1995, the couple issued a jointly agreed statement. It was the closest either of them ever came to speaking publicly about the marriage, and it is the single most important quotation in the whole story. Throughout the marriage, they said, they had always tended to follow rather different interests, but in recent years they had led, in their own words, completely separate lives. They had grown apart, the statement went on, to such an extent that, with the exception of their children and a lasting friendship, there was little of common interest between them. There was no blame in it. There was no anger, no accusation, no naming of the prince, no settling of scores after everything that had been done to them. There was only the calm, careful, faintly formal language of two people who had decided, together, exactly how their marriage would be described to the world, and who described it with the same restraint they had shown for 21 years. The divorce itself was a no-fault proceeding, founded on the simple fact that the couple had lived apart for 2 years. There was no scandal in the courtroom, no washing of linen, no fight over money or children conducted through hostile lawyers, none of the ugliness that so often attends the ending of a marriage. The decree was made absolute on the 3rd of March, 1995. The marriage had lasted 21 completed years, from the 4th of July, 1973, to the 3rd of March, 1995, past its 21st anniversary, and short of its 22nd. It is worth stating the figure precisely, because looser accounts sometimes say 22 years, and the true span is 21. 2 decades and 1 year from the society wedding of the season to a decree absolute on a quiet March afternoon, with everything the marriage had contained now emptied out into the public record. The choice of a no-fault divorce, on the simple ground of 2 years' separation, was itself a final act of the code. There were other roads the couple could have taken, roads that assigned blame and named names and turned the ending into a fight. They took none of them. They chose the quietest legal route available, the one that required no accusation and produced no courtroom drama, and they walked it without a public word of complaint against one another, or against the prince who had been part of their marriage for 2 decades. In an age that had made a spectacle of every other royal parting, the Parker Bowleses managed to make their own almost invisible, a matter of a paragraph and a decree. And that invisibility was the last gift the old discretion gave them before it vanished from the world for good. Set the ending beside the beginning, and the symmetry is almost unbearable, and the film should let the audience feel the full weight of the contrast. The marriage began with 800 guests, a queen mother, 2 princesses, a Catholic service in a barracks chapel, and a family tiara. It ended with a jointly agreed paragraph, a 2-year separation, and a decree absolute readout in a registry. It began as the society wedding of the season and ended as the most discreet divorce the circumstances could possibly allow. 21 years separated the 2 scenes, and in that time the couple had raised 2 children, weathered 2 revived romances, survived a tape that crossed the world and a confession watched by 13 million people, and endured the total exposure of their private life. And still, at the very end, they reached for the same tool they had used all along, discretion, and ended the marriage as quietly as the age would still let them end anything. The establishment's relief at the ending was caught in a single dry line by the courtier Lord Charteris, who is reported to have said that the divorce would clear the heir, and, yes, of course, Charles would be king. In those few words lived the whole logic of the world this marriage had served. The arrangement had done its work. It had held the appearance together for as long as the appearance could be held, and when it could be held no longer, it dissolved itself with the minimum of damage to the thing that mattered most to that world, which was the succession. Charles would be king. The marriage that had helped make his private life livable for 2 decades had ended, cleanly, and the great machine of monarchy simply moved on, as it always does, absorbing the scandal and continuing toward the next reign. Look closely at the language of that joint statement, because it is a small masterpiece of the code the marriage had always lived by. Every word in it was chosen to give nothing away. It spoke of different interests, of separate lives, of growing apart, of a lasting friendship, and it spoke of them in the flat, courteous register of 2 people determined to deny the newspapers a single quotable wound. There was no mention of the prince, no mention of the affairs on either side, no hint of blame or anger or grief. After 21 years and the most public humiliation of the age, the couple described the end of their marriage in the language of a business partnership dissolving amicably. It was the last act of discretion in a marriage built on discretion, and it was pitch perfect, and it told the watching world precisely nothing it did not already know. That the divorce could be conducted so quietly in an age that had torn every other royal privacy to shreds is itself remarkable, and it says something about the 2 people at its centre. They had every reason to fight and every opportunity to profit from fighting, and they refused both. There was no rush to the newspapers, no rival memoirs, no bitter briefings from either side. The marriage that had been exposed so brutally by others was ended, by the 2 people inside it, with a dignity that the exposure had never managed to take from them. And when the courtier Lord Charteris caught the establishment's relief in his dry little line about clearing the air, He was also, without quite meaning to, paying the couple a compliment. They had made even their ending easy for the institution to absorb. And there is one more thing the quiet ending reveals, which is how little the two of them wished to punish one another. A marriage exposed as theirs had been gives each partner ample cause for anger and ample means to act on it. Yet neither reached for the weapons the age was handing out so freely. They divided their long life together without a public quarrel, kept their children clear of the wreckage, and walked away as friends. In a decade, defined by royal spouses turning on one another before the cameras, the Parker Bowleses turned toward one another instead, and ended the marriage with the same care they had shown while keeping it. For Andrew, the divorce came as a release rather than a defeat, and what he did next proved that the marriage had never been the enemy. He was free, at 55, of a union that had been, for all its private strangeness, a genuine and lasting friendship. He would marry again, and marry happily. He would remain close to Camilla for the rest of his life, closer than most divorced couples ever managed to stay. And he would live to see the woman he had divorced crowned Queen of the United Kingdom, seated in Westminster Abbey among the family, applauding, an old man in his 80s watching the strangest possible ending to the strangest of marriages. The arrangement was over at last. The affection it had somehow contained was not, and it would outlast the marriage, the scandal, and very nearly everything else in the story. Chapter 13. The friendship that refused to curdle. Most divorces leave a wound, and this one left something that looks, from a distance, almost like proof. When a marriage ends in scandal and public humiliation, bitterness is the ordinary result. Wounded people lash out, or withdraw into cold silence, or spend the rest of their lives nursing the grievance and telling anyone who will listen how badly they were wronged. What is most remarkable about the end of the Parker Bowles marriage is how completely it refused to follow that ordinary pattern. Neither partner curdled. Both did almost the opposite, and the absence of bitterness is, in its quiet way, the strongest single piece of evidence for what the marriage had actually been all along. In 1996, the year after the divorce, Andrew married again. His second wife was Rosemary Pittman, born Rosemary Dickinson on the 17th of June 1940, a long-standing companion who had previously been married to Lieutenant Colonel John Hugh Pittman, and who had 3 sons of her own. By all accounts, the marriage was contented and happy, a peaceful second act for a man who had lived a very public and very complicated first one. Andrew, at last, was married to someone with whom the elaborate arrangement of his first marriage was simply unnecessary, someone he could be married to in the ordinary way. The charming, faithless officer of the 1960s had reached, in his late 50s, a settled and quiet happiness, and by every sign he valued it all the more for having come to it so late. The proof of the strange grace at the center of this story came at Rosemary's death. She died of complications from cancer on the 10th of January 2010. Princess Anne, Andrew's old flame from the early 1970s, the princess he could never have married, was among the mourners at her funeral. And Camilla, the first wife, the woman whose own marriage to Andrew had ended in the most public scandal of the age, was reportedly deeply saddened by Rosemary's death and attended a memorial service for her that March. Read that slowly, because it is the whole point of the chapter and very nearly the whole point of the film. The former wife openly grieved the second wife. The woman at the very center of the scandal mourned the woman who had come after her, and the grief was real, and no one who knew them found it strange. That single fact tells the audience most of what it needs to understand about how these people managed their tangled lives. There was no war between the first wife and the second. There was no lingering enmity, no score to settle, no coldness kept alive for decades out of wounded pride. When Rosemary died, Camilla grieved her, and Princess Anne stood among the mourners, and the whole gathering was a portrait of people who had long ago decided to be kind to one another rather than cruel. These were two people at peace with one another. They were, in the deepest and most durable sense, friends. And the friendship had survived the very thing that destroys most marriages and most friendships alike, which is the truth coming out and being printed on every front page in the land for the whole world to read. Set that grief beside the ordinary aftermath of a scandalous divorce, and the strangeness of it stands out sharply. In most such stories, the former spouses spend the rest of their lives at a careful distance, or worse, trading wounds through lawyers and newspapers for years. Andrew and Camilla did the opposite. They stayed woven into the same family, the same friendships, the same country world, present at one another's weddings and funerals and family occasions, easy in one another's company to the end. The divorce had ended the marriage on paper, but it had not touched the deeper thing underneath, the long friendship that had been there before the marriage and remained after it. That friendship, tested by the worst the age could do, simply refused to break, and its refusal is the quiet miracle at the heart of the aftermath. It is worth measuring the distance between the scandal and the grace, because the years between them are themselves the proof. In January 1993, the tape crossed the world. In June 1994, the prince confessed on television to 13 million viewers. In March 1995, the marriage was dissolved. In 1996, Andrew remarried. And in 2010, when his second wife died, his first wife mourned her at a memorial service, and his old princess stood at the graveside beside him. 17 years separated the height of the humiliation from that quiet gathering. And in all that time, the poison that usually follows such a scandal had simply failed to appear. Something in these people, some trained instinct toward kindness and away from spectacle, had refused to let it take root. There is a tenderness in Andrew's second marriage that the film should honor, because it completes the portrait of the man. Rosemary Pittman was not a consolation prize or a public rehabilitation. She was a companion he seems genuinely to have loved, and with whom he built the ordinary, faithful, private happiness that his first marriage, for all its warmth, had never been able to be. The charming officer, who could not, in his youth, fasten himself to one person, found in his late 50s that he could, and did. It is a quietly moving thing, a man arriving late at the simple happiness that had eluded him all his life and finding it worth the wait. And when Rosemary died in 2010, after some 14 years of that happiness, Andrew grieved a genuine loss, the loss of the settled love of his later years. And it is in that grief that the strangest and most telling detail sits. Camilla came to mourn Rosemary. The first wife came to grieve the second, and no one who understood these people found it out of place. There was a whole web of loyalty and affection connecting all of them, Andrew, Camilla, Rosemary, Princess Anne, that had survived every scandal the age could throw at it, because it had never been built on the thing the scandals were about. It had been built on friendship, on the long shared history of a small world, on a kind of loyalty that outlasted marriages and endured past death. When Camilla stood at that memorial service in the spring of 2010, she was not performing forgiveness. She was simply being what she had always been to Andrew, a friend, and the friendship was older and deeper than the marriage it had outlived. A cynic might say the kindness was simply good manners, the reflex of a class trained never to make a scene. But manners alone do not bring a woman to grieve at the memorial of the wife who replaced her. That takes something warmer than breeding, a real and durable regard for the man they had both loved and for the life they had all shared. The grace was genuine, whatever its roots. and it is the clearest window the story offers into what these people actually were to one another. The reason it failed to appear is the reason the whole film has been building toward from the very first chapter. The Parker Bowles marriage had never been a war between a wronged party and a guilty one. It had always been an arrangement between two people who liked each other and had agreed, with open eyes, on the terms of their shared life. When such a marriage ends, there is no villain left to hate and no victim left to avenge, and so there is nothing for the bitterness to feed upon. There is only the ending of a long partnership between two friends, and friends, when they part well, can go on caring for one another for the rest of their lives. Andrew and Camilla parted well as two people can part. And the friendship they kept would carry them, improbably, all the way to the steps of a throne, and to the strangest image in the entire story. Chapter 14. The First Husband at the Coronation. In the spring of 2023, he sat among the family and watched his former wife crowned queen. The friendship between Andrew and Camilla held, unbroken, to the very end of both their public stories, and it produced a series of images that no scriptwriter would ever dare to invent. On the 9th of April 2005, Charles and Camilla were at last married, in a civil ceremony at the Windsor Guildhall, more than 30 years after Camilla had first loved the prince and lost him to a naval posting in the Caribbean. Among the guests were Andrew Parker Bowles and his wife Rosemary. The first husband attended the wedding of his former wife to the man who had been part of their marriage for its whole length, and he did so as a friend, without any visible strain, because by then the strangeness of it had simply become the shape of their lives, and everyone in that circle had long since stopped finding it remarkable at all. Then came the image that crowns the entire story. On the 6th of May 2023, at Westminster Abbey, Charles III was crowned king, and Camilla was crowned queen beside him, before the assembled state and a watching world. And seated among the family, watching, was Andrew Parker Bowles, an old man in his 80s, with his and Camilla's 2 children present in the abbey. The first husband sat and watched his former wife become Queen of the United Kingdom. It is an image astonishing on its own terms. The officer who had married her in a barracks chapel almost 50 years earlier, in his Household Cavalry uniform, now watching in his old age as she was crowned beside the very man who had shared their marriage for 2 decades. The wheel of the whole story had turned as far as a wheel can turn, from the wedding of the season in a guard's chapel to the coronation of the century in the abbey, with the same quiet man present at both ends of it. Andrew himself had, by then, become an unlikely national curiosity, the friendly former husband of the Queen, and something more permanent besides. In the very years of the marriage, he had been immortalised by one of the greatest British painters of the age. Between 2003 and 2004, Lucian Freud painted his portrait, a vast canvas titled The Brigadier, showing Andrew in the very Household Cavalry uniform of his loyal service. The painting is roughly 7 feet high by 4.5 feet wide, a monumental image of the man in the clothes of his public life, unsmiling, imposing, and entirely himself. In 2015, it was sold at Christie's in New York on the 11th of November for $34.89 million US, one of the most valuable British paintings of its whole generation. Sit with the scale of that, because it is one of the strangest scale figures in the whole royal story. A portrait of Andrew Parker Bowles, in the uniform he had worn at his own wedding and at the sovereign's side, sold at auction for $34.89 million US. The canvas stands 7 feet high. It was painted by Lucian Freud, one of the defining artists of his century. The man in the picture had served 34 years in uniform ridden in the Grand National, commanded a squadron in the largest army operation since the Suez Crisis, held the office of Silver Stick in waiting to the Queen, and been made permanent by a great painter even as the marriage that had shaped his public reputation dissolved around him. The uniform that had been the visible half of a hidden marriage now hangs, 7 feet tall, among the treasures of the modern art world, worth a sum that would have bought the Guards' Chapel and everyone in it many times over. That a portrait of him should have become one of the most valuable British paintings of its age adds a final strangeness to the story, and a fitting one. Lucian Freud did not paint minor figures. He painted people he found compelling, and he spent months studying Andrew Parker Bowles in that uniform, seeing in him something worth a great canvas. What Freud saw was the very thing this film has traced: a man entirely defined by his public role, upright and imposing in the clothes of his service, with the whole private truth of his life kept invisible behind the composed and soldierly face. The painting captured the visible half of the man perfectly, because the visible half was all anyone was ever shown. The hidden half, the arrangement, the silence, the long, strange marriage, was not in the picture, because it was never anywhere a painter or a public could see, and the man in the uniform lived on, and lives on still. Andrew Parker Bowles remained close to Princess Anne, whose daughter Zara Tyndall is his goddaughter, a last living thread back to the romance of the early 1970s that his Catholicism had once made impossible. In December of 2023, he was reported to be in a relationship with the broadcaster Anne Robinson. Still, in his 80s, the charming companion he had always been, still riding out, still at ease in the world that had made him and had never quite managed to shame him. He had outlived the scandal, outlived his second wife, and outlived the very age that had exposed him, and he had done all of it without ever once breaking his silence about the marriage at the centre of his life. Think about what it must have been to sit in that abbey as the first husband. 50 years earlier, he had stood at an altar in a barracks chapel and married the young woman beside him, in the uniform of the sovereign's bodyguard, with the Queen Mother and 2 princesses looking on. Now he sat in Westminster Abbey, an old man, and watched that same woman crowned Queen of the United Kingdom beside the man who had been the third presence in their marriage for its whole length. Whatever passed through his mind in that moment, he kept it to himself, as he had kept everything to himself for half a century. He applauded, and he said nothing, and he went home. There is no stranger seat in the whole of the modern royal story than the one Andrew Parker Bowles occupied that May morning, and no man ever filled a stranger seat more quietly. The portrait completes the picture, and it is worth holding beside the coronation. For while the marriage was still running, Lucian Freud had spent months painting Andrew in that same Household Cavalry uniform, and the result was a canvas 7 feet high that would one day sell for more than $34 million. So the uniform exists twice over, once on the living man who wore it to a wedding and a coronation, and once on the giant canvas that hangs in the galleries of the art world, both of them images of a man defined by his loyal service and remembered by the wider public for the private thing that service concealed. The visible half of the marriage was painted 7 feet tall and sold for a fortune. The hidden half was never painted at all. The arrangement had outlived the marriage. The affection had outlived them both. And what survives now, physically and in memory, is a strange and telling collection: 2 children and their families, a 7-foot portrait among the most valuable British paintings of its generation, 2 Wiltshire houses long since sold to other families, and an old soldier still close to a princess, still silent, still smiling. The wedding of the season had become the coronation of the century, and the officer who began the story was present for both, in the same uniform, keeping the same silence he had kept all along. But the meaning of his story reaches past the man and the marriage, out into the whole system he lived inside. And the film has to widen its lens one last time to see it whole. Chapter 15. The System in Plain Sight. The Parker Bowles marriage was never only about two people. It was a keyhole onto how the great kept their secrets. Step back from the two people and look at the machine, because the Parker Bowles marriage is a keyhole onto forces far larger than one couple in the Wiltshire countryside. It sits directly on top of several of the great currents of 20th century British life, and each of them helps explain why the arrangement lasted as long as it did, and why, in the end, it could not last at all. The private story is also a public one, about a whole class and a whole century, and the slow, final death of a way of keeping secrets that had endured for generations. The first current is the aristocratic tolerance of infidelity. The world Andrew and Camilla came from had, for generations, treated the discreet affair within an upper-class marriage as a manageable feature of the institution rather than a scandal that must destroy it. It was a code of separate lives and mutual silence, of appearances kept up for the sake of family and position and inheritance. And it was designed to let marriages survive what would sink an ordinary household. The Parker Bowles marriage ran on that code, and it stands now as one of its last and most famous examples, very possibly the final time it would ever be lived so completely and so publicly, before the modern world swept the whole code away for good and left nothing of it behind but scandal. The second current is the collision of Catholicism and the Crown. Andrew's faith had barred him from marrying Princess Anne, had shaped the Roman Catholic wedding at the Guards' Chapel, and had made divorce a graver matter for the couple than it would have been for others of a different faith. That faith reached back to the Act of Settlement of 1701 and to centuries of English anxiety about Catholics near the throne, a whole architecture of law and suspicion built to keep the old religion at a careful distance from the succession. The same religion that had placed a princess forever beyond Andrew's reach also helped bind him to the marriage he made instead. One more reason the arrangement was always preferable to an ending. One more wall around a marriage that might otherwise have opened and let its occupants go free. The third current is the one that finally broke the marriage, the collapse of royal deference and the rise of the tabloid monarchy. For most of the 20th century, the British press protected the private lives of the royal family as a matter of unspoken duty and shared assumption. The whole arrangement depended utterly on that protection, and neither Andrew nor Camilla had ever had to ask for it. The War of the Waleses marked the exact moment the protection was withdrawn, when newspapers and broadcasters stopped treating the royal family's private lives as off-limits and began treating them as the single greatest story in the country, worth any sum and any intrusion and any recording device. The Parker Bowles marriage ended as collateral damage of that larger rupture. The arrangement had always needed discretion above all other things, and discretion was the one commodity the new media would never again be willing to supply to anyone. These three currents did not act separately. They met and reinforced one another in the single life of this one marriage, which is what makes it such a perfect keyhole. The aristocratic code told Andrew and Camilla that their arrangement was permissible. The Catholic faith told Andrew that ending it would be worse than keeping it. And the deference of the old press told them both that the arrangement would never be exposed. Three great forces, ancient and powerful, all leaned in the same direction, toward keeping the marriage standing and its secret kept. For 20 years they held. And then, in the space of a few years in the early 1990s, the third force simply collapsed. And once the press turned, the other two could not hold the structure alone. The marriage that 3 centuries of English custom had made possible was undone by a single decade of English journalism. Andrew's own place in that transition was captured, cruelly, by a single press nickname, one the film should hand firmly to the newspapers rather than adopt in its own voice. He was called, in the papers, the man who laid down his wife for his country, a bitter little phrase whose precise origin is not firmly documented and which is best presented simply as the epithet the press attached to him. It is ugly, and it is unfair, and it is also, in its own way, a perfect summary of the whole transition the story records. In the old world, a man in Andrew's position was owed discretion by everyone around him, as a matter of course. In the new one, he was owed only a headline, and the crueler, the better. The nickname is the sound of the door closing on the long age of looking away, the sound of one world ending and a harsher one beginning. There is a way of telling the Parker Bowles story as a simple morality tale. The wronged wife, the guilty mistress, the faithless husbands, and the film should say plainly why that telling is false. The real story is not about good people and bad people. It is about a system that had worked for centuries and was destroyed in a single decade by forces none of its participants controlled. Andrew and Camilla did not break the rules of their world. They kept them, faithfully, for 21 years. What changed was not their conduct, but the world around it, the arrival of a press and a public that no longer accepted the rules the couple had lived by. The scandal, in the end, was less a story about 2 people behaving badly than a story about a whole way of life reaching its end, and 2 people caught on the wrong side of the line when it fell. And something genuine was lost when it fell, even if much was gained. The tabloid age that ended the old deference also gave the country a monarchy it could see clearly, human and flawed, and no longer hidden behind a screen of managed silence. That was, in many ways, a healthier thing. But it came at a cost, and the Parker Bowles marriage was part of the price. A world in which private pain could be kept private, in which a person might fail at love in the shadows and still hold their public dignity, gave way to a world in which nothing could be hidden and everything could be sold. The film need not mourn the old order to notice that its passing took real things with it, and the quiet dignity of a silent soldier was one of them. This is why the Parker Bowles marriage is worth a film at all, long after the scandal that made it famous has faded. It is not merely a tale of who loved whom. It is a record of the exact moment a centuries-old way of living reached its limit and broke. Seen through the 2 people, it broke over. What died, along with the discretion, was a whole understanding of the boundary between public duty and private life. The world that had produced the Parker Bowles arrangement believed, sincerely, that a person could serve the crown faithfully in public while keeping their private affairs entirely to themselves, and that the 2 need never be allowed to meet. The tabloid age erased that boundary completely and forever. After the War of the Waleses, there was no private life left for the great, only material that had not yet been published. The arrangement had been the last and most conspicuous flowering of an older idea. And when it fell, the idea itself fell with it, and it did not rise again in any recognizable form. Which leaves the hardest question of all, the one the whole film has been circling from its very first minute, and it turns out to be a question not about scandal at all, but about the true nature of a marriage. Chapter 16. Arrangement, or the truest marriage of all. In the end, the hardest question is not what they did to each other, but whether it was a lie at all. For 21 years, 2 people performed a marriage the country believed in and lived a marriage the country would never have forgiven, and the distance between those two marriages was held open by an entire establishment. The families who made the match wanted it held. The faith that discouraged its ending wanted it held. The palace that prized the husband's loyalty wanted it held. The class that had always tolerated the discreet affair wanted it held. And for 21 years, the country agreed to look away. The first truth this story reveals is that the arrangement was never a private failing of two weak or wicked people. It was a collective achievement. It took a whole establishment, working quietly in the same direction and asking no questions, to keep it standing for as long as it stood. But the film must not end on judgment, because judgment is the one response the evidence will not quite support, however tempting it is to reach for a tidy verdict. It would be easy to call it a cynical bargain and close the book. And yet, everything that came after argues against so simple a conclusion. Within that arrangement were two people who genuinely liked each other, who raised a family together, and who stayed loyal friends for 50 years through a second marriage, a royal remarriage, a coronation, and old age. When one of them buried a second wife, the other grieved her at the graveside. Whatever else this was, it was not loveless, and any honest telling has to hold that fact steadily beside all the others, however much it complicates the easy story. And here is the reversal the whole story has been moving toward. It was not a lie. It was a bargain, and both of them had signed it with open eyes. Neither Andrew nor Camilla ever pretended to themselves that the marriage was something other than what it was. They knew exactly what they had agreed to, and they kept that agreement, its freedoms and its silences alike, for 21 years, and a friendship long beyond. A lie deceives the people inside it. This deceived only the people outside it, the 800 guests in the chapel and the watching country beyond them, who saw devotion where there was arrangement, and who were, in the end, the only ones ever truly fooled by any of it. There is a deeper truth underneath the ambiguity, and it is the truth this whole story has been quietly teaching. What a society chooses to call devotion, and what it chooses to call betrayal, has always depended as much on who is watching as on what is done. For 20 years, the Parker Bowles marriage was called devotion, because the country saw only its surface. For a few years after the exposure, it was called betrayal, because the country was suddenly shown its depths. The marriage itself did not change between those two verdicts. Only the watching changed. And that is the most unsettling lesson of the whole affair, that the difference between a celebrated marriage and a disgraced one may lie not in the conduct of the two people inside it, but in how much of it the rest of the world is permitted to see. So the film lands where honesty demands, on an ambiguity it refuses to resolve for the audience. Was the Parker Bowles marriage a cynical accommodation? Two clever people using an old code to take exactly what they wanted while keeping the appearance intact? Or was it an unusually clear-eyed kind of devotion? A marriage honest enough with itself to survive what would have shattered a more romantic one? The fact that both partners ended as friends, and that the country ended by crowning one of them, may say more about what the great have always been quietly permitted than about the truth of two human hearts. The audience is left holding both possibilities at once, because the story itself never chose between them, and perhaps in the end, it could not. Weigh the two verdicts honestly, because the film owes the audience the fairest version of each. The case for the cold reading is real. Two people married under a kind of duress, neither fully committed, both unfaithful within a few years, kept the marriage going for 2 decades because ending it was inconvenient and staying was comfortable, and let a young woman be drawn into the middle of it who never understood what she was joining. Told that way, it is a story of selfishness dressed up as decorum, and there is truth in the telling. Diana's suffering was real. and the arrangement, however civilized, helped cause it. The film must not let the warmth of the ending erase the wreckage along the way. But the case for the warmer reading is just as real, and it comes from the people themselves. They liked each other. They raised their children with love. They stayed friends for 50 years, through everything, and grieved one another's losses, and one of them mourned the other's second wife. Whatever the marriage was, it produced a loyalty that outlasted the marriage by decades, and loyalty of that depth is not usually the fruit of a merely cynical bargain. Perhaps the truth is that both readings are correct at once, that a marriage can be both an arrangement and a real bond, both a failure of one promise and the keeping of every other. That is not a comfortable conclusion, and the film should not pretend it is. It is simply the most honest one the evidence allows. And perhaps that is why the story refuses to settle into a simple shape even now, decades after it ended. The people at its center gave the world almost nothing to judge them by. One careful paragraph and a lifetime of silence. And into that silence, every observer pours their own conclusion. Some see two selfish people who dressed their appetites in good manners. Others see a marriage of rare and clear-eyed honesty that outlasted everything thrown at it. The story allows both, and insists on neither, and that refusal is its final and most faithful truth. Return, at the last, to the image where the story began. The young officer in the uniform of the sovereign's own bodyguard, tall and charming and Catholic, walking into a barracks chapel on a July afternoon to marry the woman who had waited 7 years for him. He wore that uniform at the wedding. He wore it through 34 years of loyal service to the crown. He wore it in the 7-foot portrait that now hangs among the most valuable British paintings of its age. And he wore it, in memory, at the coronation of the woman he had married and divorced, seated among the family, an old man keeping the silence of a lifetime. The uniform was always the visible half of the marriage. The other half stayed behind the door, exactly as the code intended it should. And only when the country stopped pretending did anyone outside the circle ever see it at all. In their own words, the only ones they ever offered the world, they had led completely separate lives. It is the truest thing either of them ever said in public, and it is also, read one way, the saddest sentence in the whole story, and read another way. The most honest description of a marriage the royal history of this country has ever produced. They had led completely separate lives, together for 21 years, and they remained friends for 50. Whether that was the coldest arrangement or the warmest honesty in the whole of the modern monarchy is a question the Crown has never answered, and perhaps never could. And it is the question this old soldier in his silent uniform will carry with him to the very end. If the stories the palace would rather keep buried are what you come here for, subscribe to Silenced Crown and stay with me. And before you go, tell me this. Was the Parker Bowles marriage a cynical arrangement, or the most honest marriage in the whole royal story? Comment where you land and where in the world you are watching from.